So now you've asked yourself the right questions. You know, most importantly, why you're putting in the cover crop, and you've chosen the seed blend. Now it's time to get started with cover cropping. Let's take a look at the different kinds of planting equipment you'll need. We'll start with the most commonly used piece of equipment for cover cropping, and that's a drill. On average, drills have the highest likelihood of a successful stand, often 80 to 100% of the time. Generally, they can also use a lower seeding rate compared to other seeding methods. Drills are best in fields where moisture may be limiting because they create the best seed to soil contact. They also perform the best if you want to plant after the cash crop has been harvested and you're seeding into high residue. The major drawback of a drill is that it's the most expensive option for equipment. Using a drill can also create limited seeding window and growth potential in northern climates. Spinner spreaders are another option. They're especially good for when you need to apply a cover crop seed quickly over a large number of acres. This is one of the cheapest planting methods, and it will also allow you to combine the cover crop seed with fertilizer. However, there are circumstances where spinner spreaders aren't the best way to spread the cover crop seed. They're not ideal for small seeded or light cover crop seeds like red clover, annual ryegrass, or phacelia. They'll also need a higher seeding rate, and the spread pattern can be inadequate. Generally, you can expect a successful stand 2 or 3 out of every 5 years when using a spinner. One final caution: never let the dry fertilizer and the cover crop seed sit together in the hopper of your spreader for more than a few hours. The high salt content of many dry fertilizers can dry out the seed and kill the germ. Custom spreader boxes on tillage equipment are another option. Examples of this include air seeder boxes like a Gandy box mounted onto vertical tillage equipment, a rolling basket, harrow, or rotary hoe. Like spinner spreaders, this method is cost-effective and a great way for quickly covering many acres. It can also save you equipment costs if you're able to retrofit an existing piece of equipment. This method does have a lower stand consistency, especially in heavy residue, and it can't carry as much seed compared to a drill or broadcasting. Another piece of equipment to consider is a high clearance seeder, like a highboy. They can be especially good if you're a grower in a northern region, since it allows you to utilize species that take more time to establish winter hardiness, like a cool season legume, brassicas, or certain broadleafs. They're also a good option if you want to offset the nitrogen cost but need more time for the legumes to establish winter hardiness. However, be aware of the potential for late season yield loss due to ear or pod knockdown. Also, stand establishment will be reliant upon rains since the seed is not incorporated into the soil. Airplanes are another good way to spread seed. Using an airplane can be cheaper than a drill, roughly $10 to $12 an acre, compared to the $16 to $22 an acre of a drill. It's another way to quickly seed a large area. Airplanes are especially good method if you've had a wet fall and are trying to avoid extra traffic across your field. They do require a higher seeding rate compared to other methods, and like a spinner spreader, they can create inconsistent or patchy stands, with successful stands occurring only about every 2 to 3 out of 5 years. The final equipment that we'll discuss is drones. There have been huge recent advancements in drone technology, and they're now competitive for both cover crop application as well as spraying. Drones work best with small seeded cover crops and when covering a small number of acres. You may find them most useful for seeding small patches inaccessible by other methods, or, like aerial seeding, when you want to establish a cover crop prior to harvest while also minimizing crop damage.
So when you look at the no-till culture in the front, it's kind of the beginning. It kind of opens up the soil. That way your disc openers don't have to work as hard. And let's say we're planting corn. We want 2 inches on the depth.
Yep.
That coulter in the front helps us achieve the 2 inches. So the disc openers can get down and with this type of seed meter that just puts it down. I think we like to, maybe every 8 inches. And so you want that 1 corn seed right there. And so these Mohawks, what we use as a closing wheel, as you see, now this one is worn a little bit, but that one is a newer one. Every 2 years you have to change them. So, and you have some bearings that go out from time to time, but generally about every 2 years we'll change them all. And so you can see, like, for the spring of 2023, all these coulters and openers will have to be changed. So yeah, but that's one of those huge expenses that you may not like to do, but you have to. So, like, we'll go through and change everything. In my opinion, when we go to the field, like, you see these coulters and blades, we already know we don't want to have any trouble. We want the planter to do what it's designed to do.
Right.
And so because it hurts your yield, you would think that, man, I can still use that disc opener or that pair. It's still got a little life in it. But it'll be that row that won't do like the rest of them if you change them out. So as a general rule for us, we want to change. At this point, it's like we just change everything so we know it's doing what it's designed to do.
The downforce is, it changed from crop to crop, month to month, and probably from some cases field to field. Like I said, the strip till, we can run a bare minimum down pressure. Now, when we get into the wheat planting soybeans behind wheat, then you're gonna need a little bit more down pressure because of the residue and the wheat straw that's left on top of the ground.
Yeah, that soil will be a lot firmer. So, and as it starts to dry out, because when we harvest the wheat in the summer, as it dries out, we like to be right behind the combine, but sometimes it doesn't work like that. But the drier it gets, you got to have more pressure to get that soybean down into some moisture.
Yeah.
So that's key. So those are things you have to keep checking on from day to day or every couple of days. Just keep an eye on it. See what the seeds look like. Are they planted in moisture? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I can tell you this: the downtime is, you don't want downtime, because if a bearing goes out on disc opener, it seems like it's a domino effect. When one goes out, if you don't change them both, then the next day it'll go out, and you'll be changing disc openers when you should be planting. So that's why we try to, we just change them. Like, if you change one right on this row unit, you just change both of them.
Yeah.
So you don't have the downtime.
Right.
Before you plant a cover crop, you'll need to have a plan for when and how you'll terminate it. Cover crop termination strategies must be based on weather and field conditions to avoid cash crop damage or loss while maximizing the benefit of the cover crops. If you use crop insurance, it is also important that they be in compliance with crop insurance guidelines, which do vary widely from region to region. There are 6 main termination strategies for cover crops. Each has pros and cons. The method you choose will depend on your cash crops, weather and field conditions, RMA guidelines, and your own preferences for other factors like using herbicides. The first termination strategy we'll go over is winter kill. Winter kill refers to the cover crops that grow significantly in the summer and fall and then die naturally with freezing temperatures. Winter kill is an easy option for first-time cover croppers who don't want to deal with termination or biomass accumulation in the spring. Winter kill is easiest to manage in northern climates, and it can still generate significant soil benefits depending on planting date and species used. However, winter kill provides little to no soil armor when spring comes around. Additionally, it's not the best way to build soil biology or soil structure because of the very limited amount of time living roots are in the soil. If you choose to go with winter kill, make sure you know the kill temperatures of the cover crops you choose. For example, buckwheat easily dies at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but radish can even survive down to about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Spraying herbicide is the fastest and easiest way to terminate a cover crop. There are many herbicides available whether you use GM or non-GM crops. However, studies have shown that herbicides can have a negative effect on soil microbiome, which impacts soil fertility and cash crop growth. If you choose this termination strategy, make sure to follow the herbicide label and use appropriate water conditioners and spreader stickers. In addition, fulvic acid can also translocate herbicides more efficiently through the cover crop, which improves herbicide efficacy. Grazing is another method of cover crop termination, although it's generally less effective than other methods. Grazing reduces the amount of biomass you'll be planting into, but it's very species selective as most cover crops will grow back. If you choose this termination method, you'll probably need to go back with a herbicide during the post-emergent spray window to make sure your cover crop has been effectively terminated. You'll also need to monitor soil conditions in the field to avoid compaction before planting. Mowing has similar pros and cons as grazing. An additional benefit is that with mowing, the residue creates additional soil armor, which can potentially reduce weed germination. However, this residue isn't as effective as planting green. The fifth termination strategy is roller crimping. Crimpers are 16-inch rolling steel drums with blunt blades attached. The crimper is either tractor pulled or front mounted, and as it rolls through a cover crop, the blades crimp or injure plant stems every 7 inches to mechanically terminate the cover crop. Roller crimping can kill up to 90 to 100% of a cover crop, depending on the crop it's used with and its stage of termination. Cereal rye and hairy vetch are generally the easiest to roller crimp. Roller crimping creates a dense mat that suppresses weeds but can inhibit cash crops' planting depths. For roller crimping, timing in relation to cash crop planting is a key consideration. With corn, roller crimping is generally done before crop emergence. Many soybean farmers have reported roller crimping their cover crop with standing soybeans up to the B3 stage without experiencing any yield loss. The final termination strategy we'll discuss is tillage. Tillage can be highly effective depending on the number of passes done and the implementation type used. The normal tillage program you've been using will likely not create the same seed bed after adding cover crops. This means that additional adjustments may be needed. Strip tillage can be a particularly effective way to maintain living cover in the row spaces to keep weeds suppressed until the first herbicide pass. However, from a soil health standpoint, minimizing disturbance is ideal to improve the overall soil microbiome. Next, we'll discuss RMA guidelines on cover crop termination. It's always best for cover crop decisions to be guided by your own agronomic needs and goals. That said, this information will provide some direction for cover crop guidelines for crop insurance. These guidelines were created to provide some simplicity for growers, but aren't a substitute for specific agronomic guidance. Here are some key points from the RMA guidelines. These guidelines were created primarily to address moisture management. Zones with ample moisture have more flexibility to terminate cover crops after planting the insured cash crop. Zones with limited moisture suggest terminating cover crops sooner. Cover crops may be hayed or grazed where not specifically prohibited, such as summer fallow regions. Interseeding is allowed as long as the cover crop doesn't interfere with the management of the insured crop. Growers using no-till have an additional 7 days to terminate their cover crops from the termination guidelines provided. Even in areas where moisture isn't limited, the guidelines call for cover crops to be terminated before emergence of the cash crop. Again, these are guidelines, and if you have guidance from an agronomic expert or have used different practices in the past, you can terminate the cover crops after cash crop emergence and still maintain crop insurance.
So the termination is, we're still working on when and how we should do that best on our farm. It depends on the cover crop that's out there as to what your timing needs to be. In early years, we just grew the grasses and the rye principally, sometimes oats. You get the most benefit from them in terms of mulching and organic matter covering biomass, I think is what they call it today, if you let those grass crops grow and tiller. And you don't want to produce seed because for two reasons. One, we raise wheat, and the rye seed, if you let it go to maturity and reseed naturally, we've got a contaminated wheat field the next year. So we have to terminate rye and make sure there are no viable seeds. So we have to kill that early enough. We've also found that those grasses, and particularly the rye, their stems, this is good for mulch, but it is a terrible problem for us to plant into. Those stems are fibrous enough that with the moisture we have, and we can have 80% humidity at planting time, they absorb that moisture and they become like sisal rope, and our planter cannot go through those, especially planting cotton. So the grasses, we've learned we need to terminate earlier than we did at first. That's a hard-learned lesson. The brassicas, our winters sometimes kill them and sometimes don't. That can be handled with glyphosate. They're tough, but you can get them, but hopefully the winter kills those. The clover in our mixes today, we allow to go as long as possible. We think that is the way we can get the most benefit out of them for nitrogen fixation. That's worked well. They also provide an awful lot of biomass if they're allowed to grow and bloom in the spring, and we try to let them go to full bloom. And then we terminate those probably 10 days before we plant, usually with a herbicide mix. And this year, for the first time, we tried terminating the grasses much earlier, for reasons I just mentioned, with a clethodim product, just a grass herbicide to stop their growth. They stay, it's a slow-acting product, so they stay, their root masses hopefully are still doing the work, but we don't get that very difficult, fibrous cover that entangles the planter if we terminate them before the plant's created. And we let the broadleafs grow. So we're learning. That's a new idea for us this year. But that termination event and how to do it well, it's expensive. It's not only the chemical, but the trip across the field, and 2 trips across the field is more complicated to manage than 1 trip across the field and more diesel. So again, it's not instant perfect in the circumstance, but you can, every farmer will figure out what works for them. Planting green is something a lot of people espouse. Just plant into it and then terminate behind the planter. We've tried that. It did not. The planting event was just a mess for us in that circumstance. Our springs can be colder and wetter than we want for ideal seed soil conditions, and the cover crops only make that worse, if worse is the right word. The shading and the green stuff keeps that moisture and then in the soil so long that it stays too wet to plant for too late on our calendar.
While your specific goals and regional growing conditions will have the most influence on your cover crop decisions, cover cropping methods and techniques can also change depending on your cash crop. Let's look at cover cropping with 3 major cash crops: corn, soybeans, and wheat or small grains. For corn, the best cover crop options are generally legumes like red clover, winter peas, and hairy vetch, and brassicas like radish, turnip, forage collards, and winter canola. However, make sure the brassicas are less than 25% of the mix. Grasses like oats, triticale, and annual ryegrass are also a good option, but they can have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio if they reach maturity, so aim for them to be less than 50% of the mix. Corn growers will have 3 major considerations for deciding when to terminate: moisture management, weed management, and nitrogen management. Corn growers will typically terminate their cover crops 10 to 14 days ahead of cash crop planting. If you have more experience with cover cropping, you can terminate later, up to the same day as planting or prior to emergence, as long as you have adequate soil moisture and nitrogen availability. For soybean growers, brassicas will help make phosphorus more available, but they shouldn't make up more than 50% of the mix. The mix can be supplemented with grasses like cereal rye and triticale, which are great for weed control in beans, and legumes like red clover, as long as they're not more than 25% of the mix. Soybean growers will want to consider moisture and weed management when choosing termination timing. For soybean growers, it's most common to plant green and terminate the day of planting or within 7 days of soybean emergence. This is something you'll need to check with RMA guidelines before you begin. For first-time cover crop use ahead of soybeans, herbicide is the easiest termination strategy, but roller crimping is also very effective if available in your climate. If you decide to terminate with roller crimping, make sure the cover crop has reached adequate maturity so the crimping will be effective. For wheat and small grains, legumes like red clover planted with the wheat are a good option for cover crops because they'll both supply nitrogen and help control weeds. Brassicas, especially winter-killed ones like radish and forage collards, are another good option ahead of wheat. This is because wheat doesn't like the competition of being planted into living plants or thick residue. With wheat, the termination strategy will depend primarily on moisture and nitrogen availability for the main crop. Similar to corn, wheat or small grains growers will generally terminate cover crops 10 to 14 days ahead of planting, although it can also be done up to planting day or prior to emergence. However, the termination date you choose will vary greatly depending on where you're located. If you're in a western state, you may need to terminate cover crops as early as 90 days before planting based on RMA guidelines. It is also critical to manage the nitrogen tie-up from the cover crop by adjusting application timing. To do this, you'll need to consider the C/N ratio of the cover crop residue and apply nitrogen closer to cash crop planting, and support the microbial community with additions of humic acid, sugar, and/or molasses. If you're able to, we also recommend using biologicals combined with soil microbial food to boost germination and early crop vigor. For more crop-specific cover crop information, regional and local information is available through Extension, Indigo Agronomists, and regional cover crop councils.